Donald Trump just experienced the most humiliating moment of his entire life. Inside a packed Manhattan courtroom with cameras rolling and the world watching, the former president stood before Judge Juan Merchan for sentencing in his criminal conviction. And what happened next was so shocking that even seasoned legal reporters sat there in stunned silence. After the judge delivered his sentence, Trump's lawyers immediately requested a brief recess. When court resumed just 11 minutes later, Trump took the microphone himself, and what he said in just 4 words changed everything. Hit that subscribe button right now because you absolutely won't want to miss any of the videos I release covering this historic moment. So what exactly did Trump say that left an entire courtroom speechless? According to multiple reporters present in the room, after Judge Merchan announced the sentence, Trump leaned over to his legal team, visibly shaken. His lead attorney, Todd Blanche, requested an immediate sidebar. When they returned, Trump asked to address the court directly. Judge Merchan granted the request, and that's when Trump stepped to the lectern, gripped both sides with white knuckles, looked directly at the judge and said these 4 words, "I can't do this." The courtroom went absolutely silent. Not a single person moved. Even the sketch artist stopped drawing. Because those 4 words from a man who has never admitted defeat, never shown weakness, never backed down from anything, represented a complete psychological collapse that nobody saw coming. This wasn't some calculated political strategy or negotiated statement approved by lawyers. This was a raw, unfiltered moment of genuine human breakdown caught on camera for history to witness. Reporters in the courtroom say Trump's voice cracked on the word "can't," and that he appeared to be fighting back tears as he stood there waiting for Judge Merchant's response. For a man whose entire public persona has been built on projecting strength, dominance, and invincibility, this represented a shattering of the image he spent 5 decades constructing. Smash that like button if you're following this so far. Here's the full picture of what led to this extraordinary moment. On January 10, 2025, Donald Trump appeared in Manhattan criminal court for sentencing after being convicted on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records related to hush money payments during the 2016 election. The trial had concluded months earlier with a jury verdict that shocked half the nation and vindicated the other half. But between the verdict and sentencing, Trump's legal team had filed 47 separate motions attempting to delay, dismiss, or overturn the conviction. Every single motion was denied. Judge Merchant made it crystal clear that sentencing would proceed as scheduled and that no amount of legal maneuvering would change that timeline. The days leading up to January 10th were reportedly chaotic inside Trump's legal and political operations. Sources close to the situation told reporters that Trump was oscillating between rage and despair, sometimes within the same conversation. He would spend hours on the phone insisting the whole thing was rigged, that he'd be vindicated on appeal, that his supporters would never abandon him. Then he'd fall into these long silences where staffers said he just stared out windows, not responding when people spoke to him. A longtime advisor who requested anonymity told NBC that Trump seemed to be experiencing what they called a reckoning with reality that he'd managed to avoid his entire life. For the first time, consequences were actually arriving and there was no escape hatch. When Trump arrived at the courthouse on the morning of January 10th at 8:47 a.m., photographers captured images that went viral within minutes. His face looked drawn, almost gray. The usual defiant smirk was completely absent. He walked slowly, not with his typical aggressive stride. Secret Service agents had to gently guide him because he seemed almost disoriented by the crowd of reporters shouting questions. One CBS correspondent who's covered Trump for years said on air that she'd never seen him look that defeated, that it was like watching a completely different person than the man who dominated headlines for a decade. Drop a comment right now if you're still processing all of this. I read every single one. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense from the moment proceedings began at 9:30 a.m. Judge Merchant opened by acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the situation, sentencing a former president, a current candidate for office, someone who still commanded the loyalty of millions of Americans. The judge spoke carefully, emphasizing that the law must apply equally to all citizens regardless of position or influence. He reviewed the jury's verdict, the evidence presented at trial, the seriousness of the crimes committed, And then he addressed the matter of Trump's behavior throughout the legal process, noting the attacks on the court, the violations of gag orders, the complete absence of remorse or accountability. Here's where it really gets serious. Judge Merchant explained that while the crimes themselves might typically warrant a lighter sentence, Trump's conduct after conviction demonstrated a fundamental contempt for the judicial system that could not be ignored. The judge cited specific examples: the social media posts attacking prosecutors and witnesses, the repeated violations of court orders, the public statements undermining faith in the legal system itself. Merchant stated that a former president of all people should understand the critical importance of respecting legal processes even when facing personal consequences. The fact that Trump had done the opposite required the court to consider more than just the underlying crimes. At 10:18 a.m., Judge Merchant delivered the sentence 4 years in federal prison, with a recommendation that Trump serve at minimum 2 years before being eligible for any form of supervised release. The courtroom erupted. Trump's supporters in the gallery began shouting. Several had to be removed by court security. Trump himself seemed to physically deflate in his chair, his shoulders slumping forward as though all the air had been sucked from his lungs. His lead attorney, Todd Blanche, immediately stood and requested a brief recess, stating that they needed to confer with their client about next steps. Judge Merchant granted a 15-minute break. What happened during those 15 minutes is now the subject of intense speculation and reporting. Multiple sources present in the courthouse have provided details to major news organizations. According to these accounts, Trump was escorted to a private holding area adjacent to the courtroom. His legal team surrounded him, speaking in urgent tones about appeals, about legal options, about the path forward. But Trump reportedly wasn't listening. He sat in a chair, head in his hands, repeating over and over that this couldn't be happening. A court officer who was stationed outside the room told CNN that he could hear Trump's voice rising and falling, sometimes yelling about how unfair everything was, sometimes falling completely silent. Todd Blanche, his lead lawyer, apparently tried to walk him through the reality of the situation. They would immediately file appeals. The sentence could be stayed pending those appeals. Trump might not see the inside of a prison cell for months or even years, depending on how the legal process unfolded. But sources say Trump kept asking the same question: what if the appeals don't work? What if this actually happens? And his lawyers, who had spent months assuring him that conviction was impossible and that even if convicted, he'd never face serious consequences, had no good answer to give him. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. When court reconvened at 10:33 a.m., everyone expected Trump's lawyers to make some standard statement about their intent to appeal, about their confidence in ultimate vindication. Instead, Todd Blanche stood and made an unusual request. He asked if his client could address the court directly before the proceeding concluded. Judge Merchant appeared surprised but agreed, reminding Trump that anything he said would be on the record and could be used in future legal proceedings. Trump nodded and slowly rose from his seat at the defense table. Reporters who were present say that Trump's walk to the lectern seemed to take forever. He moved like someone in a daze, not making eye contact with anyone. When he reached the microphone, he gripped the sides of the lectern so hard that his knuckles turned white. He stared down at the wood surface for several seconds. The entire courtroom held its breath. And then Trump looked up, made direct eye contact with Judge Merchant, and spoke those 4 words that nobody expected: "I can't do this." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Merchant leaned forward, asking Trump to clarify what he meant. Trump's voice, according to multiple witnesses, was barely above a whisper as he repeated himself: "I can't do this. I can't go to prison. I'm 78 years old. I can't." His voice broke completely on that last word. Several reporters noted that Trump appeared to be fighting back tears, something absolutely no one had ever seen from him in public. A courtroom sketch artist told the New York Times that she stopped drawing because she couldn't believe what she was witnessing and wanted to simply observe this historic moment. Judge Merchant, clearly taken aback, asked Trump if he was requesting to make a formal statement. Trump just shook his head and said, "I'm just telling you the truth. For the first time in my life, I'm telling you the truth. I can't do this." He then turned and walked back to the defense table, sitting down heavily in his chair and covering his face with both hands. The courtroom remained completely silent. Even the prosecutors sat there looking stunned, uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented moment. Here's what should alarm everyone, regardless of your political affiliation. What we witnessed was the complete psychological breakdown of someone who has spent their entire existence constructing an impenetrable facade of strength and invincibility. Trump's entire identity, his business brand, his political movement, everything has been predicated on the idea that he never loses, never backs down, never admits weakness. And in that courtroom in front of the world, that facade didn't just crack, it shattered completely. A former federal prosecutor watching the proceedings told MSNBC that in 30 years of criminal law, she had never seen anything remotely comparable. The moment when a defendant realizes that reality is inescapable, that no amount of bluster or denial can change what's happening, is always difficult to witness. But seeing it happen to a former president was genuinely surreal. Judge Merchant handled the situation with remarkable composure. He addressed Trump directly, acknowledging that facing criminal consequences is difficult for anyone, but that the law must be applied fairly to all citizens. The judge noted that Trump still had the right to appeal, that nothing was final until all legal remedies had been exhausted. But he also made clear that the sentence would stand and that Trump needed to prepare himself for what was likely to come. Merchant then formally concluded the sentencing hearing, setting a date 30 days out for Trump to surrender to federal custody unless his appeals resulted in a stay of the sentence. If this blows your mind, hit that like button right now. The reaction to Trump's courtroom breakdown has been absolutely extraordinary. Within minutes of reporters sharing what happened, social media erupted. Trump's most devoted supporters initially claimed the reports were fake news, that their president would never show weakness like that. But then the video footage was released. Court cameras had captured everything, and there it was for the world to see. Donald Trump, the man who projected strength above all else, admitting in open court that he couldn't handle the consequences of his actions. The cognitive dissonance among his base was immediate and profound. Some supporters began questioning everything. If Trump was this broken by a 4-year sentence, what did that say about his mental fitness for office? How could he possibly serve as president again if he couldn't handle the pressure of his legal troubles? Others doubled down, claiming this was all evidence of persecution, that the system had finally broken even the strongest man through sheer unfairness. The mega movement essentially fractured in real time between those who saw weakness and those who saw martyrdom. Meanwhile, Trump's political opponents were navigating an unexpected emotional landscape. Yes, they wanted accountability. Yes, they believed he deserved consequences. But actually, watching another human being collapse under the weight of those consequences, regardless of who that person was, created a strange mix of vindication and discomfort. A Democratic strategist told Politico that the 4 words, "I can't do this," would define Trump's legacy far more than any of his political accomplishments or scandals, because they represented the ultimate admission that his entire persona had been a performance that reality finally forced him to abandon. The legal implications of Trump's statement are still being analyzed. Some experts argue that his admission represents a tacit acknowledgement of guilt. That saying, "I can't do this," implies acceptance that prison is the appropriate consequence. Others caution against reading too much into what was clearly an emotional outburst rather than a calculated legal statement. But everyone agrees on one thing. Trump's appeals will now be significantly more difficult because his own words in court suggested acceptance of the sentence's legitimacy, even if he later tries to walk that back. Subscribe immediately if you haven't yet. This content doesn't exist anywhere else. Here's what happens next. Trump's legal team has already filed notice of appeal, arguing that the sentence was excessive and that the trial itself was fundamentally flawed. They're requesting that the sentence be stayed pending the outcome of their appeals, which could take months or even years to resolve. But here's the problem they're facing. Judges evaluating stay requests typically consider whether the defendant is likely to prevail on appeal and whether there's a compelling reason to delay the sentence. Trump's courtroom breakdown actually works against him on both counts. It suggests he recognizes the legitimacy of the outcome, and it undermines arguments about his fitness to remain free pending appeal. The political ramifications are equally profound. Trump is currently the frontrunner for the Republican nomination in 2026. But how does a candidate run for president while facing imminent imprisonment? How do you project strength and leadership after the entire world watched you break down and admit you can't handle the consequences of your own actions? Republican strategists are reportedly in complete panic mode, with some arguing that the party needs to find an alternative candidate, while others insist that abandoning Trump now would fracture the party irreparably. And here's the truly unprecedented part. If Trump's appeals fail and he's required to surrender to federal custody, he would become the first former president in American history to serve time in prison. The logistics alone are staggering. How do you incarcerate someone who still has Secret Service protection? What facility could house a former president securely? How would his continued political campaign operate from behind bars? These aren't theoretical questions anymore. They're practical challenges that federal authorities are actively planning for right now. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'm genuinely curious to see your perspective. But beyond all the political and legal analysis, what happened in that Manhattan courtroom represents something fundamentally human. We watched someone who has spent decades avoiding accountability, who built an empire on the appearance of invincibility, finally confront a reality that no amount of money, influence, or bluster could change. Those 4 words, "I can't do this," will echo through history, not just as a legal moment, but as a psychological one. The moment when the facade finally crumbled completely. Military veterans who Trump courted aggressively throughout his political career have had particularly strong reactions. Many expressed disappointment that someone who positioned himself as the ultimate tough guy couldn't handle consequences that millions of ordinary Americans face in the criminal justice system every year. A retired Marine colonel told Fox News that leaders are defined by how they handle adversity, and that watching Trump collapse under pressure was deeply disillusioning for those who believed in his strength-based leadership style. Legal historians are already comparing this moment to other famous courtroom scenes in American history. The Watergate defendants who broke down on the stand, Bernie Madoff's emotional collapse when his Ponzi scheme unraveled. But those were private citizens or political operatives. This was a former president of the United States, someone who commanded nuclear weapons, who represented American power to the world. And the image of him gripping that lectern, voice-breaking, admitting he couldn't handle what was coming, will define how history remembers this era. Here's the situation as it stands right now. Donald Trump has been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for criminal convictions related to falsifying business records. During the sentencing hearing, he suffered a complete emotional breakdown, telling the judge, "I can't do this," in a moment of raw vulnerability that shocked everyone present. His legal team is filing appeals that could delay his surrender to custody for months or years, but the psychological damage is done. The world has now seen behind the curtain, and what they found was not the invincible strong man of his own mythology, but a 78-year-old man terrified of spending his final years behind bars. Stay with me, because what comes next will completely change how you view everything. The implications for American politics are absolutely staggering. For nearly a decade, Trump's political power has rested on a simple premise. He's stronger than everyone else, tougher than the system, immune to the rules that govern ordinary people. His supporters believed in that premise so deeply that they overlooked scandals, excused behavior, defended the indefensible, all because they believed he was fundamentally unstoppable. 4 words destroyed that premise completely. "I can't do this" is the antithesis of everything Trump has represented. Its vulnerability, its admission of limits, its acknowledgement that reality can't be bent through sheer force of will. Republican lawmakers are facing an impossible choice. Do they continue supporting a nominee who just admitted in open court that he can't handle the consequences of his actions? Or do they break with him, risking the fury of a base that still largely supports him despite what they witnessed? Several GOP senators have already begun quietly signaling that they think the party needs to move on, though none are willing to say it publicly yet. The political calculation is brutal. Stick with Trump and risk association with his breakdown, or abandon him and risk losing his voters entirely. Meanwhile, prosecutors in other cases are watching closely. Trump still faces charges in Georgia related to election interference. Federal cases regarding classified documents and January 6th activities are working through the courts. His Manhattan breakdown will absolutely be referenced in those proceedings as evidence of someone finally confronting reality rather than continuing to deny and deflect. Each prosecutor now has video evidence of Trump admitting he can't handle consequences, which undermines every future claim of persecution or political witch hunt. The global reaction has been equally dramatic. Foreign leaders who dealt with Trump during his presidency have made carefully worded statements expressing that criminal justice systems must be respected. But privately, diplomatic sources tell reporters that America's adversaries are celebrating. They're circulating the courtroom footage as evidence that American democracy is fundamentally unstable, that its leaders are weak, that the nation itself is in decline. America's allies, meanwhile, are deeply concerned about what this moment says about the state of American institutions and political culture. And here's something that hasn't been discussed enough. The immediate aftermath inside Trump Tower in Mar-a-Lago was reportedly absolute chaos. According to sources who spoke with the Washington Post, Trump's inner circle spent the hours after the sentencing in emergency conference calls trying to craft a response strategy. Some advisors wanted Trump to immediately record a defiant video message reclaiming his tough guy image. Others argued that any attempt to walk back what happened would only make things worse by drawing more attention to his breakdown. The disagreement became so heated that several longtime aides reportedly threatened to resign if Trump tried to pretend the courtroom moment never happened. His family members were equally divided on how to respond. Some wanted to release a statement emphasizing Trump's humanity, arguing that showing vulnerability might actually help him connect with voters facing their own struggles. Others insisted this was political suicide, that the base expected strength above all else and would abandon him if they thought he was weak. Meanwhile, Trump himself reportedly remained largely silent in the hours immediately following the sentencing, refusing to take calls from most advisors and spending time alone in his private quarters at Trump Tower. The financial implications are also starting to become clear. Major Republican donors who had committed significant funds to Trump's 2026 campaign are now reportedly reconsidering those commitments. A prominent GOP megadonor told Bloomberg that while they sympathized with Trump's legal troubles, they couldn't in good conscience fund a candidate who admitted in open court that he couldn't handle pressure. Multiple fundraising events scheduled for the coming weeks have been quietly postponed or canceled as organizers assess whether Trump's donors will still show up after witnessing his breakdown. Pause for a second and hit that like button if you're finding value in this coverage. Here's what we're watching for in the coming days and weeks. First, will Trump attempt to walk back his courtroom statement? Will his team try to claim he was emotional, that his words were taken out of context, that he actually remains defiant and ready to fight? The problem with that approach is the video evidence. Everyone saw what happened. Trying to retroactively reframe a moment of genuine breakdown as strategic positioning won't work when the footage speaks for itself. Second, how will Trump's legal appeals proceed? His attorneys face the difficult task of arguing for stays and reversals, while their client just admitted on the record that he can't handle the sentence. Appellate judges will inevitably reference Trump's own words when evaluating whether keeping him free pending appeals serves the interests of justice. A defendant who admits they can't do this has essentially conceded that the sentence is real and appropriate, making technical legal arguments much harder to sustain. Third, what happens to Trump's 2026 campaign? Can someone who broke down in court credibly argue they should be president again? His campaign has already released a statement calling the sentencing a miscarriage of justice and promising to fight on. But the statement notably didn't address Trump's emotional collapse or his forward admission. They're clearly hoping everyone will just forget what they saw. That seems unlikely given that the footage has already been viewed hundreds of millions of times online. Fourth, how will this affect Trump's influence within the Republican Party itself? For years, elected Republicans lived in fear of Trump's tweets, knowing that a single critical post could end their political careers by turning the base against them. But if Trump is now seen as weak, as someone who breaks under pressure, does he still command that same fear and loyalty? Early indicators suggest the answer might be no. Several Republican House members who have never publicly criticized Trump before made statements after the sentencing expressing concerns about his ability to lead effectively given the legal and emotional challenges he's facing. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, what does this mean for accountability in American democracy? For years, critics have argued that Trump seemed immune to consequences, that his wealth and status placed him above the law. What happened in that courtroom suggests those protections finally failed. Reality caught up. And when it did, the man who projected invincibility couldn't handle it. That should matter enormously for anyone concerned about whether our system can actually hold powerful people accountable. Before we go any further, smash that subscribe button so you never miss content like this. Here's where things stand as this story continues to develop. A former president of the United States just experienced a complete psychological breakdown in open court, admitting he cannot face the consequences of his criminal conviction. Those 4 words, "I can't do this," represent the end of a carefully constructed mythology about strength and invincibility that has defined American politics for nearly a decade. The legal process will continue through appeals and procedural battles, but the image of Trump gripping that lectern, voice-breaking, fighting back tears as he admitted his own limits, that's what history will remember. This isn't just another clear-throat political scandal that will fade from the news cycle. This is a defining moment that crystallizes everything about this era of American politics. The rise of a leader who promised to be stronger than the system itself, the devotion of millions who believed that promise, and the inevitable collision with reality that no amount of bluster or denial could prevent. Those 4 words changed everything because they represented the truth breaking through after years of performance. The stakes have never been clearer. Either accountability still means something in America or it doesn't. Either the law applies equally to everyone, or it's just words on paper that powerful people can ignore. What happened in that Manhattan courtroom suggests that accountability, however delayed, however resisted, can still arrive. And when it does, even the most powerful among us have to face the same reality everyone else does. Actions have consequences, and consequences can't be escaped forever. The evidence is on video. The breakdown was witnessed by dozens of people in that courtroom and millions more watching the footage online. The 4 words have been spoken and cannot be unsaid. Now we wait to see what happens next. Whether appeals will delay the inevitable, or whether Donald Trump will indeed become the first former president in American history to serve time in federal prison. Either way, the image of him standing at that lectern admitting "I can't do this" will define how this chapter of American history is remembered. The moment when the facade finally crumbled and reality at long last could no longer be denied.